Hello, everybody. My name is Spoons Rattling, and due to an event that I have to go to, I am doing another quick tier list video, again related to Risk of Rain 2, because a lot of people seem to really enjoy that video, so I decided why not continue on that. This video is just going to be on the gray items, and then eventually we'll cover the greens, the reds, the yellows, the blues, the equipments, the boss items, lunar items, all that jazz. But for now, we're just going to do the gray items, including the DLCs, and sort of rank them in terms of power. And these all will go on the same tier list, so it's going to be a general item strength thing, not just relative to each other. And let's get started. First up, we have the Soldier Syringe. Now, Soldier Syringe is a personal favorite item of mine. I tend to really like survivors that have insane fire rates. Commandos, bullet hose ability, his R. I really enjoy that. I really enjoy dual nail guns on multi. Stuff like that is things I really enjoy. So I really enjoy attack speed, and in general, attack speed is a general good thing to have with most characters. So I definitely think this is definitely... I'm not sure if I would put it in S tier, because I don't think it's quite going to make or break a run, because, I've gone runs without Soldier Syringe and with, and they've been, it's not a game-breaking item unless you get it in insane quantities. Like, if you get to 15 Soldier Syringes, then you'll have so much attack speed that it's just insane, but that's only if you run to a printer or something like that. Next up, we have Forgive Me Please. No, not Forgive Me Please. What am I talking about? Tougher Times. No, Safer Spaces? Tougher Times. This is Tougher Times. The Void one is Safer Spaces. Tougher Times is really solid. It's always nice to just have a chance to negate damage coming at you, and as you stack it, it just gets more likely. Of course, there is a limit to it given the hyperbolic stacking mechanic, but it's harder for me to turn down having at least one of these no matter what. It just gives you a chance, basically. In any situation. Risk of Rain has one-shot protection, and I use heavy quotation marks saying that because I feel like most of the times my run ends, I'm fighting a boss, I get hit with one attack, and then on the next frame I'm dead, so I'm not really sure how effective one-shot protection really is. So this being able to negate damage is just super useful. Definitely one of the best items, best items in the game, in my opinion. I'm not going to put it quite in S tier just because I'm resolving S tier for items that are truly broken to the point where they just invalidate almost everything else. Next up, we have Monster Tooth, and I'm not a big Monster Tooth fan. While this does have some use in Forgive Me Please builds, I don't think it is a particularly great use just because it gives you a bunch of these orbs that heal you a very small amount. And there's just, in general, much better ways to do healing. It's definitely very, very bad, but I'm not going to put it in F, because F is going to be things that are generally completely useless or detrimental, the rare item that actually hurts your run. It's awful. Truly awful. Now, we're getting to our first S-tier item, in my opinion. I don't think anyone's going to argue with me that Lensmaker's glasses are some of the best items in the game. Whether you have one or if you have 10, it's super useful just to have that huge extra damage bonus. It's good on every survivor. Every survivor wants crit damage, or a crit chance, I guess crit damage in the case of Railgunner. And you'll be hard-pressed to find a run where you don't want to have, where you won't end up with 3 of them. On average, I'd say, is the average amount of Lensmakers I tend to have. And if you run into a printer, that can very quickly snowball into a god run, just because you will be doing so much more damage. Definitely fantastic. Next up, we have Goat Leg. Paul's Goat Hoof, I suppose is the proper name. Very, very useful. Definitely at the top of A tier. In my opinion, it is just fantastic. Every survivor wants movement speed. It does reach a point where it's sort of diminishing returns, where you'll start to get too fast, which, surprisingly enough, for some people is a problem. I'm the kind of guy that stacks 8 wax quails, though, so that should tell you everything I need to know about that. Just absolutely fantastic. A Goat Leg is another one of those items you'll want on every run. 1 is huge, and then it just gets better with more. Next up, we have Bustling Bungus. Bungus is a fine healing option. I don't think it's exceptional, but it's definitely... I'd say it's on the upper echelon of healing items. It does have the slight problem of you needing to stand still, which isn't great, though it is useful to just have the... Because Bungus heals you faster than a lot of things does. And it's really good on Engineer, which is always great. Engineer's a fun class, so it's nice to have that, and it can make him very survivable, just having the 2 Bunguses going, or even 3 if you get a Lysate cell. Overall, fantastic. I'm definitely going to put this probably going to end up towards the lower end of B tier, mainly just because as the run goes on, Bungus tends to become less and less important. But early on in a run, it can just one Bungus can make your run because it makes things like it makes void fields, for example, so much easier because then you get to your next void cell and you just get to heal back up to full in just a few seconds. You don't waste too much time, and you get to get your items much easier. Next up, we have Crowbar. Definitely sort of a polarizing item, not in the way that people think it's good or it's bad, but it's really good on characters like Railgunner, Rebar, Multi, what's her name, Loader, or Bandit as well. Makes great use of it with his Desperados. Overall, I think Crowbar is really solid as a damage item, though not my absolute favorite. It's not as general purpose as something like Lens Makers, but I do think that at least earns it A tier. I think a lot of these sort of damage items that have their place, I guess that is sort of something to be said, is that the items that, or the characters that Crowbar is good on, Soldier Syringe isn't as good on, generally speaking. And then it flip-flops, of course. Which I think, yeah, that earns them both an A tier, in my opinion. Both super useful, and I will, it's always good to have them. And even on characters where Crowbar isn't super useful, isn't super instrumental, it can be useful just for dealing with things like wisps and small enemies, just because those enemies can sometimes be the secret killers of a run. And of course, it does play a part in some really broken abilities like Railgunner's Overcharge, or even something like Void Fiend's Mouse 2. Like if you hit someone with that with Crowbar, you'll do a lot of damage really quickly. Next up, we have Tri-Tip Dagger. Tri-Tip Dagger is really good as well. I think it sort of falls into a similar tier, probably above these, just because Bleed isn't conditional, and when you get a Bleed build going, it's just crazy. Of course, you can get other ways to apply Bleed, which does sort of lessen the impact of Tri-Tip Dagger, but it's consistent. It gives you a great chance to do it. Each one giving you 10%. It's just fantastic on characters like Multi with nail guns, Commando. It's almost an essential, or a character like Void Fiend again with his beam when he's in transformed mode. It's all generally very useful. Bleed's just fantastic. It's one of the best mechanics in the game and can very quickly snowball into just killing bosses before they even really get a chance to attack. Next up, we have War Banner. Now, I think I'm a little more positive on War Banner than some people are. I think it's a fine upgrade. It's generally useful for the Teleporter event, which is where things are going to get nasty the fastest. And just having those boosts of movement speed around the map as you passively level up is generally useful, though it does have the similar problem with Bungus, where it sort of falls off by the end of the run, where it won't be as common for you to level up, and it won't be as impactful because you'll have more general items. But I still think it ends up in C tier. It's passing, but it's not excelling. It's coasting, really. Next up, we have Cautious Slug. Now, Cautious Slug is a sleeper item. You'll pick up a Cautious Slug, and you won't note it. You won't remember you have it, but you'll feel it, right? Because you'll be regenerating health so much faster. On characters like Multi, this is essential because their health regen is just so slow innately. And in general, again, also super useful for Void Fields. And I rate it higher than Bungus personally, just because it also works while you're moving when you're not in combat, I'm going to put this in A tier. Probably closer to the bottom of A tier, but I love Cautious Slug. It's fantastic. Next up, we have Personal Shield Generator. Now, Personal Shield Generator doesn't do too much, honestly. It just gives you a little bit of extra effective health, is what I'll call it. And that does have its place, its usefulness, though I don't think it's anything, it's not anything standout. It does have a lot of synergy with Plasma Shrimp, which is one of the best void items in the game, in my opinion. And overall, I think is very, very solid. It's not very solid. Plasma Shrimp is. PSG on its own, though, I think is probably... It's a very do-nothing item. It doesn't feel like you have a lot of impact. If you get a lot of PSGs, it can keep you in the fight longer just because shields regen much faster than your health does, But overall, don't think it's very good. Next up, we have Medkit. Now, Medkit is an item that I've warmed up to a lot in recent times. Again, similar to Bungus, honestly, because it helps so much in Void Fields, just because you have... when you're waiting to regen your health, you can just go to the, just step out into the void for 1 second and then step back in and you'll get your heal. Super useful. If you start to stack it, it can actually start to become rather powerful. Though again, it's very enemy dependent. Against something like a grandparent, it's worthless. It's not going to help you against their big unmatched power of the sun. It's not going to help you there. So I think I'll put it in probably next to Bung. Yeah, no, I'll put it in C tier. Bungus has more uses, mainly just because it's so good on Engineer. But I think Medkit is a respectable item. I like having one. It just helps. It's just a nice extra to have, but nothing major, and it's not an item you can really build around. Gasoline. Gasoline is useful on every survivor. It's useful on burst survivors like Railgunner or Loader, because they will generally struggle with hordes more than others. So having this extra damage is super useful. It's amazing in Forgive Me Please builds, of course, just to stack burn. It synergizes with Ignition Tank really well. Overall, I quite like Gasoline. There's really not much more to say aside from that. And I'm going to put it up here with the sort of similar damage items that I think all accomplish similar things. They're the bedrock of a build, really. The light items are oftentimes the best items in your build, funnily enough. They're just all generally really solid. Now, speaking of, I have to regret to inform you that we're on to a white item that is not good. Flashbang. I don't think Flashbang is good, like, anywhere. Stunning as a mechanic is useful, though when it's reliable, it's useful. Again, Commandos are his bullet hose. Captain's stun beacons are actually surprisingly good, especially if you're running Diablos. Stuff like that, or Loader's pylon can be generally pretty useful. But Flashbang, the chance is low. It really doesn't do that much. Overall, I think Flashbang is awful. Truly awful, if not. It might be the worst white item in the game, funnily enough. Well, maybe there's some DLC exceptions there, but... Next up, we have Fireworks, and there's really not much to say about Fireworks. Surprisingly effective with Remote Caffeinator, but not much else from that. It'll help occasionally. If you stack a lot of Fireworks, it can be really useful for clearing hordes, but overall, Fireworks just feels like a do-nothing item. I'm going to put it in C tier. Next up, we have Soda, or Energy Drink, as it's officially called. I always call it Soda. Like the Soda! That meme. But I think Soda is really solid. I really quite like Soda. It's not my first pick when it comes to speed, mainly because it doesn't affect you when you're not sprinting, but stacking it with other movement buffs is generally super useful. I really quite like it. Since it's not my first rate and it's situationally useful, not always useful, like all these ones up, and... Yeah, I'll put Slug at the top of B tier as well. Put this above it. Soda is useful. It stacks really well with other movement speed buffs because it makes you sprint. It makes your sprint faster, so it interacts really well with normal movement speed buffs. Overall, super useful. Next up, we have backup mags. Backup mags are character by character useful. Some like Loader, they're essential to have multiple grappling hooks. But on characters like Acrid, where the cooldown on his mouse 2 is so short it may as well not exist, it basically does nothing. Oh, excuse me. Or on like Commando, Captain, whose mouse 2 really doesn't do that much. Backup mag is probably, again, it's a B tier item. It's situationally useful, depends on the survivor. For some, it's a game winner. For others, it just doesn't really do anything, which I think earns it this. Next up, we have Sticky Bomb. I'm not a fan of Sticky Bomb. I've never done like a crazy Sticky Bomb build. I've never really found a way to do that. I know that with Railgunner, it can be good to just gamble on the idea that the big shot will hit a Sticky Bomb, which will then hit insane damage. But yeah, I don't know. It really doesn't do much for me. It feels very similar to Firework, where it's just like an item that occasionally does things and often not that well. I often find with Sticky Bomb, it'll proc when I've already killed something, so the bomb doesn't really do anything. Next up, we have Rusted Key. Rusted Key, I think, is probably one of the weaker items, but not weak enough to put it down, like, at the bottom of C or D tier. Mainly just because, 9 times out of 10, when you open your lockbox, you're just going to get a green item, and a lot of green items are pretty bad. Yeah, so Rusted Key I don't think is anything special. I don't jump for joy when I get it, but it's useful. But it's effectively a one-for-one item trade. It's not like Sail Star, where Sail Star gets you extra items. This, you're just trading out an item that does nothing for an item that might do something, and even then, it's not guaranteed. Out of all the whites, it's one of my least favorites, but for the potential to get an extra red on round 2, it is definitely, I think, at least C tier. Probably right around here. AP rounds, absolutely fantastic. Never leave home without AP rounds. They're always usually a secondary damage item. I prefer to have, whether it be glasses, bleed, crowbar, something like that, and then AP rounds adds on multiplicatively to the damage increase from there, which can lead to huge benefits. Next up we have Topaz Brooch, which is an okay item in my opinion. Probably C tier again. It's useful in Forgive Me Please builds, just because when you get enough Gestures of the Drowned, you'll effectively be invincible, just because it will keep generating barrier faster than enemies can kill it, especially once you get 5 or 6 dolls down, or whatever it may be with Forgive Me Please. But on its own, it doesn't really do too much. You need to stack quite a few of it for it to be noticeable. I do like that it rewards you for playing aggressive, because that's when the game's at its most fun. If you start getting crazy multi-kills, you can get a decent barrier going, but you definitely need to stack Topaz Brooch before it really becomes anything of note. And for that, I think it ends up in C tier. Next up, we have Focus Crystal. This is also, I'm just going to skip straight to the point. This is going with the other damage items. Also, I'm going to move this one down. Focus Crystal, more multiplicative damage. Only really useful on certain survivors, like Railgunner's not going to be in kissing range of Mithrix for this to be activatable, or any enemy for that matter. But for units like Loader, Mercenary, why can't I think? Void Fiend, Acrid, Multi with nail guns, they'll all be right up in the enemy's grill, and this is just a nice damage bonus. Again, for the melee survivors, it's effectively just an always damage boost, which is super useful. Unconditional damage is fantastic, and it multiplies with the other damage buffers. Next up, we have Bison Steak. I'm going to put Bison Steak in D tier, probably above Flashbang, just because I think it gives you extra spikes with the Lost Sun, which at least puts it above Stun Grenade, in my opinion. But yeah, it's Bison Steak. Doesn't really do anything. I think it really deserves a rework, honestly. Next up, we have Repulsion Armor Plate. Now, this sees use mainly in, like, Hellfire Tincture builds. I've actually never done a Hellfire Tincture build just because it seems rather obtuse to get, because you have to get a Planula, which you can reliably only sometimes get on Stage 5 on Stage 5, or if you get a family event earlier. But yeah, it doesn't do that much. It falls off very quickly. It can be useful against things like Gunners, which are secretly very deadly, just because they hit you with so many low damage attacks. Reducing 5 damage on each of them is nice, but it's never something I go out of my way. Like, if I see a printer with this in it, I don't think I would ever hit that. It's just not particularly useful. I'm going to put it in C tier. Next up, White Scrap, since this is technically an item, is S tier because it can become any white item. Therefore, it is the best white item. Moving on. Now on to the Survivors of the Void. Now, the Survivors of the Void whites are are generally pretty good now that I think about it. I really think about it. Mocha. I'm going to put Mocha at the bottom of A tier, just because Mocha, as a drop, isn't particularly fantastic, though movement speed and attack speed is always good. But in a printer, it's effectively just 2 printers in one if you have just a couple whites to scrap, which can make it very high value to stack, just because, it's one item that does the job of both. But just getting it out of like a multi-shop or a chest is nice, though nothing really is too special, as it's obviously outclassed by its 2 full cousins, the Soldier Syringe and the Pulse Go Tooth. Next up, we have Delicate Watch. Again, more damage. Damage items are always fantastic. They will be the bedrock of your build. The reason I don't put them all in S tier is A, S tier would get very crowded, and B, again, I'm reserving S tier for items that make the most broken builds in the game. And that will usually be one sort of kingpin item that does it, not necessarily the items that it interacts with, in my opinion at least. Anyways, what was I saying? Oh, yeah, Delicate Watch, very useful. It can lead to a bit of a brick wall effect, though. where you will get hit by one big attack, all your watches disappear and your damage drops off a cliff, and then you die because you can't do any damage. But just having a few watches, I wouldn't rely just on watches for damage because that is gambling. You'd be surprised how often you can get hit by something like an elite larva, for example, will hit you, all your watches are gone, and your run's effectively over. So don't just rely on watches. Have some sort of backup plan, whether it be Prion accumulator, royal capacitor, something like that to deal damage in the meantime while you rebuild your items. But yeah, delicate watch is really good. I can't deny that. Next up, roll of pennies is really, it's a top of D tier item. It doesn't do much. It can be useful in the early game to interact with fire elites. Just by walking into their trails, you'll get a bunch of money. But it falls off basically after stage like 2. There's a much better items for making extra money, and overall it just really doesn't do that much and is very weak in general, in my opinion. Next up we have Power Elixir. Now Power Elixir is it's sort of like a poor man's Dios, while also offering insurance against your watches getting broken, which is very useful because this will activate before your watches will break. Which means if I'm running a lot of watches, I like to have at least a few Power Elixirs, really, just in case things go sideways, which they very often can in Risk of Rain. But overall, I don't think it's really anything to write home about aside from that. I'm going to put it at the bottom of B tier just because it helps with a very good item in the watches, but it doesn't do too much else outside that, because even with the massive heal, I have been killed through Power Elixir before. It just pops my Power Elixir, and then I get hit with the same attack, and I'm dead. That's how it goes sometimes. Or I'm fighting something like a Wandering Vagrant. I'm already at low health. I get hit by a wisp or something. My Power Elixir pops, and then I get blasted by the Vagrant and die anyways. But still, mainly just as insurance for watches, it's very useful. Next up, Opal. I quite like Opal, personally. I'm going to put it at the top of B tier, just because you won't be getting hit very often if you're playing well, in general, and having the first hit you take be negated effectively, because you'll have just huge damage reduction, is super useful. Also pairs really well with safer spaces, and in general is just a nice survivability buff because, again, you won't be getting hit often if you're playing well, and when you do get hit, you won't take almost any damage. It can lead to a situation where you'll feel invincible until, of course, something happens in 0.32 seconds where you are dead before you even realize what's going on. You'll be at full health and then immediately dead, because one-shot protection doesn't exist. It's a myth. And with that, we're on to Seekers of the Storm. Now, the Seekers of the Storm Whites don't have the best reputation, though I'm not going to argue that, though I don't necessarily dislike them. I will say, what is this? Something Echoes? Warped Echoes, that's what it is. Warped Echoes I don't like. I am going to put this one probably in D tier, probably around like Flashbang, mainly just because it's an item that feels like it doesn't do much. With certain builds, I think it actually could be very interesting, something like Gestures of the Drowned and Demon Fruit. What's the fruit called? The one that heals you for 50% of your health. So Gestures, Fruit, and Echoes, just because you'll be healing like every second for most of your health, and any damage you take will be greatly reduced by this, and will just be healed off, and then the second wave of damage will be healed off again. But that's a very niche use, and in general, I don't find it particularly useful. Next up, Chronic Expansion. Now, I don't know what the opinion on Chronic Expansion is, but I love Chronic Expansion. It rewards you for playing aggressively, which is great. And also, with Forgive Me Please, it is the easiest god build in the game. Just get some Gestures of the Drowned, Forgive Me Please, and Chronic Expansion. Run around the map for 3 minutes, and you will be doing so much damage that bosses will be killed in one shot, almost no matter what survivor you're playing. It is one of the easiest items to break, and I do kind of love it for that. Though on its own, it's just sort of a fine item. This is too high up for it, though, because it really only comes into its own with Forgive Me Please. However, I do love the design of the item and want to see more like that when we get next DLC pack, whenever that may be. Next, Knockback Fin. Knockback Fin is a funny item. and that at least gives it some bonus points. You'll definitely know you have it, especially if you're playing someone that shoots rapidly, because then it leads to you sending wisps to the moon every time you shoot at them, which is very funny. Though it doesn't do too much aside from that. I'm probably going to put it sort of in this tier where it's not detrimental, it doesn't hurt you, but it's not going to win you the game. I imagine it has more use on people like Railgunner who can struggle if they get swarmed. Just having extra ways to get enemies off you is generally useful. Next up, we have Bolstering Lantern. Now, Bolstering Lantern is, again, it's going to fall into this tier, sort of the do-nothing tier, because, A, you generally don't want to be at low health, but I suppose getting a big damage buff when you are is a good incentive. And I'm sure there's someone out there that knows how to turn Bolstering Lantern into like a permanent damage buff just by, managing your health just right, which in that case I think it has, a place as a fun item, but it's really only useful as just like, it's useful. This is something I haven't really thought of, but I've definitely noticed in game. When you're low health in a boss fight, usually in like stage 1 or 2, where you don't quite have the capabilities to heal in a fight, so you run off to the side to go heal. This is useful for getting rid of those enemies that maraud at you, because you'll be doing more damage, and will in general be very useful. For that mainly, not much else aside from that though. What is this? Reflection Antlers? I don't think that's what they're called, but it's what they are. So you have a chance to reflect damage back at the attacker. Similar to the others, just doesn't do too much. But it is funny. Gives your guys horns, so I like that. I'm actually going to move fireworks up, but it just doesn't do much. It could occasionally kill a wisp or something like that if you get lucky. But yeah, it doesn't do much. I don't find it to be like a completely dead item. I know you would think that the do-nothings would end up in D tier, but in D tier, weirdly, I find it's items that do things, but they're things that aren't very useful. Where the ones up here are more just useful in niche situations, which is a weird thing, but I guess it may just speak to how I play that I don't find these of almost any use outside of PSG with Plasma Shrimp. But with that, I believe we've covered every common item in the game. There definitely will be, of course, follow-up parts to this, covering the rest of the tiers, and then we will do a big compilation video as well, I think. Let me know what you think down below. I know I was rather conservative with my S tiers. I probably could have bumped, leg, and some of the other A tiers up to S tier, but I'm trying to be restrained with my S tier picks, personally. Anyways, been Spoons Rattling. Hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you all next time.